Hello, my name is Michael Farris. Some of you may be familiar with the book that I co-authored with a friend of mine on vaccination, and that will come up possibly here a little bit as we're discussing things. But I'm going to share my testimony about how I came to believe in Jesus Christ and what that foundation was based upon. And as with many people, uh, sometimes you have your ups and downs. It can be bumpy along the way, but the divine hand of providence is merciful and it guides along the way. And so for me, in my upbringing, I was Catholic, which uh, doesn't necessarily mean that you're religious or you're studying the Bible, but you go Christmas, Easter, that time, that type of religion, very simple, but not where there's necessarily a big change of heart. But my experience growing up wasn't necessarily moved by religion, but I guess you could say living in the world, being secular. And um, my life involved a lot of fighting, I guess you could say. I lived in South Florida. I grew up in Miami, and there were a lot of racial tensions, and a lot of racial problems, particularly in South Miami, where I grew up. And so I guess you could say I was a minority in the area that I lived. And this was problematic and it shaped me. And you'll hear a little bit more about my older brother because he plays a big role in how I end up becoming a believer and having faith in Jesus Christ. So it wasn't abnormal for me, before I could tell you this, by the time I was 3 and 4 years old, I was already in fist fights. I know this might sound odd. I was doing sit ups and push ups and learning how to punch and so forth like that. Grew up as a poor white boy in a predominantly black area, and was frequently called white cracker. And it was that tense. As a matter of fact, I even had an incident where some of my friends, when I was just a kid, some of my friends, they were a couple black guys of mine who were friends of mine. They took me to a swimming pool. They wanted me to go with them, and when they got me there, I was the only white kid that was at the pool, and a number of the people that were at the pool, number of these black guys came up and they kind of surrounded me, and they told my friends, they said, this white boy, he needs to leave, and if he doesn't leave, we're going to we're going to physically deal with him. We're going to beat the tar out of him, and as a matter of fact, if you bring this white boy back into this neighborhood or back into this area again, we're also going to physically deal with you. And so that was kind of the upbringing that I had growing up around that, where I had to defend myself and I had to fight. It was a strange kind of environment, if you will. It wasn't all where you have violence 24/7, but it that was a large cloud that you could say that was over it. I mean, even to the point where people would try to break into my home where I lived, trying to get in, throwing rocks at the window. I remember, opening up my door. Someone, just to give you one example, I can give you many, but opening up my door, and right when I opened up my door, being hit my face by someone, punched, and then us fighting into the living room, going around into the dining room, and we're fighting, and it's like that bad. And it was like that for my brother as well. And my older brother, there'd be times where he'd be fighting 10 guys, and they would be jumping him, calling him white cracker, doing that kind of stuff. Now, when you have this type of stuff happening day in and day out, it affects you. It affects the way that you think. And a lot of the stuff that you see here in the United States, I don't know how it is in Norway or some of these other places, but I can tell you that in the United States, the thing that you hear about from the media all the time is about how uh, whites are racist and so forth like that, and they give you this specific narrative. My experience was entirely different. It was the exact opposite. It was the exact opposite, and um, to the point where uh, it caused me to become really angry. I guess you could say really, really angry, hate, full of anger, full of hatred. Not because I had some father, because my parents were separated. It was just me, my brother, my mother. My parents, my father wasn't. He had him and my mother were divorced. But the thing is this is I didn't have someone standing over me telling, uttering racial things to me. Hey, don't like black people. Hey, don't do that. It wasn't like that at all. I actually went to school where blacks did not like white people, and they hated them, and they called them white cracker, and they called them honky, and they jumped them, and they would, try to break into the house. Like there's an incident with my brother, as I was mentioning, as he was coming home, and you know, he was having to fight all these guys off of him, while they were throwing out all the racial epitaphs and all that type of stuff. But when he made it into the house, they started throwing rocks through the window. And so it was that kind of environment. And with this backdrop, you have this hatred kind of welling and bubbling where we're like, I am so sick and tired of this, and I'm tired of these blacks, and I got to fight you all day long, and it's frustrating. And around this time period, and again, I'm just a little kid during this time period in grade school, and my brother's older, and this stuff continues. What I'm mentioning, even up as I get older. But my father, and this is where it gets kind of interesting. My father uh, ends up reaching out. He ends up reaching out, and one of the other things, before I even mention that, I should say this because this is going to be important later on. That my brother, he started skipping school, and he got into a lot of trouble because he didn't want to, be in those type of environments. But he had his own problems and got into trouble and so forth. And he actually ended up getting kicked out of public school. And because of it, my mother had to find a school for him. And she found a boarding school. And this boarding school was a Christian school, it was a Methodist school. And this is interesting because this, again, plays a role into how we later become Christians of the Protestant, background. Um, while he was there at the school, they exposed him to the prophetic interpretation of what we call dispensationalism or futurism, as a lot of people know it. A lot of people may be familiar with uh, the Left Behind series and the expression, the secret rapture, that type of theology. So he was exposed to that. But unfortunately, because of some things that had happened, he kept catching like snakes, and because it was a boarding school out in like the country, so to speak. He kept catching snakes and not listening to them, not abiding by the rules, and he was catching poisonous ones as well. So they became concerned that he was going to, of course, get bit and then, of course, die or something like that. So because he wouldn't stop, they actually removed him. But their teaching of Bible prophecy, again, from a dispensational perspective, stuck with him. But unfortunately, by leaving the school and having to come back, it ended up leading back to that same environment that I just got done telling you about, where you have more of these problems and kind of just surviving in a rough environment. And it was around that time period again that my father reached out. He reached out to my mother and he said, "Hey, I want my boys to come and live with me." And this was different because my father, he had moved to Missouri, which was a different area than South Florida, and a, a different type of environment, one that me and my brother weren't used to. We weren't accustomed to be in an environment where, um, we're not the minority, so to speak. And so we ended up moving to Missouri. And at that time, it actually put us around poor. We were already poor white boys in the area that we live in, but this put us in an area with other poor, kind of ruffian type of uh, of white boys, and where you were more likely to see a Confederate flag flying. So it was a completely change of events for you. Now, the racial tension was still there, but it wasn't the same. The reason why it wasn't the same is because, this time I wasn't in an environment where I was outnumbered. Uh, you still had the racial tensions, but it was different because when I was in Miami, you would have these whites, and they would be getting beat up, and they were scared, and they were cowering, and I found myself always fighting by myself, or my brother fighting by myself, and the few little people that were there were scared. Where when I went to Missouri, they wouldn't take that stuff. They were poor boys, and they would throw it on in the street, and they would fight, and so it was different. And what ended up happening within a week of me getting to Missouri, I got into a fist fight with some of these guys. Again, I know this might sound funny hearing about all this fighting, but this is really my background. And I got into a fight within a week of being there. And uh, the people that I ended up fighting, we ended up becoming friends. It's almost how you became friends, because they saw that, hey, this person can hold his own type of environment. But our friendship was kind of shared on a commonality of the deep hatred that we shared, and willing to go into the street and fight and so forth like that. And I'm not going to lie, at this time it really was nice not being outnumbered anymore, and being around guys who weren't going to cower and who were willing to go on the street and fight. But this, of course, isn't good, and I would get into trouble. I was running the streets and doing that type of stuff, and generally this type of environment where I was at in Missouri, it was the kind of area where you, people drop out of school generally. It wasn't abnormal to have children at a young age, like when you're 16 years old. That type. I'm not saying this about everyone, but that wasn't something that would be unheard of or abnormal. A lot of the people that I ran with would be people who would get into trouble, go to jail, and some of them would die. Like die young. It's that kind of hard life, which is kind of sad. And also, an important factor of mentioning these racial tensions and this upbringing, where I go from one area that's predominantly black, where the black people that I was around, not all of them, I'm not saying not all, but you had this racial tension, this animosity, this disdain for whites. And now I'm in an area where you have Confederate flags flying, and there are Klan rallies. And so it kind of reversed. And again, it's not everyone that's there, but you wouldn't have found that where I was at in South Florida. It was entirely different. And at this time, my father, he saw that, hey, my son, he has this anger toward blacks. And he knew about me in Miami, and he knew why. And he realized there was serious racial tension down there. But now, because it was turning and I was getting older and I was getting more angry, and I was willing to, like, go that extra mile in violence, that my dad, he decided to do something with me. And because he did come from a Christian background, and which is also another interesting fact that I don't know if I'll have time to mention it, but he decided to take me to a Ku Klux Klan rally, and there was one that they were having. And I had never been to one. I had to learn about them in Miami and so forth like that, but my mindset wasn't to think in that way. But my dad had another ulterior motive. In other words, he wanted me to see something with my eyes so that I wouldn't go down a road of anger that I was going down. And I went to this rally with him, and I'll never forget it. I'm looking at these guys coming out, and they're flying a Confederate flag, and they're flying the swastika, the Nazi flag. And while they're going out, they're throwing their arm up and they're saying, "See Kyle, see Kyle." And my dad, he's standing behind me while this is happening. And in my mindset, I don't know what "see Kyle" means. I do know what the swastika is. I know what it was symbolic for at the time. But my dad, he kind of arches over and he puts his hand on my shoulder. And he goes, "Son, you see them throwing their arm up? You see what they're saying? They're saying, 'See Kyle.'" I think that's what they were saying. I don't know the correct German. I believe it's German. And uh, my dad said, they're saying "Hail Hitler." Now, if he had it wrong or anything like that, that's what I've always remembered since I was a kid. That he said that it meant "Hail Hitler." And as he put his arm on my shoulder, and he said that to me, he goes, "Michael, uh, your grandfather," and he's telling me this in the side of my ear. He goes, your grandfather, he fought in World War II. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and he had to fight against the Nazis. And he goes, how does that make you feel seeing this guy, this group of people flying that flag and walking on our soil over here and saying, see, Kyle? He goes, your grandfather's name was a German name. It was Otto. And he, from the fighting the Germans and fighting the Nazis, it made him so angry that he had people go by the name Michael or Mike. He didn't want to be called Otto. This is what he told me. And he goes, and so you have the name Michael, and he goes, what does this make you think when you're watching this? Now, my mindset at the time as a young person, no Klansman had ever broken into my house. No Klansman had ever thrown rocks through my window. No Klansman had ever jumped me. No one with the Nazi flag was harassing me day in and day out and calling me white cracker, and I'm me having to fight and where blood's pouring out, and it's very unpleasant. That never happened. But nevertheless, that did bother me. I didn't come out and say, hey, this is disturbing, but it stuck in my head when I was watching it, and I never forgot it. And so I was glad that my father took me and I was actually able to see that, because it kind of put a seed in my head. I knew something wasn't right with that picture. Now, again, to kind of speed this up a little bit, um, unfortunately, after a few years of living there in Missouri and being in this type of environment, um, my dad had some changes that took place in his life, and I had to move back to South Florida, back to Miami. And so here was the change again. And I, by the way, after this point, this is the last time I ever see my dad. When I moved from Missouri, I got to live there with him for a few years. And his whatever problems that I had that I was there, I was actually very thankful for it, because while I was there, he tried to influence me um, with my thinking when it came to these issues that I was dealing with. Not only that, I started hearing about Pentecostalism and that type of religion where people spoke in tongues allegedly, and so forth like that. And I remember him not being okay with that, not being on board with it. And my dad was a freelance writer, and he studied a lot of history, and there were a lot of history books that were all over the place. He was actually an intellect, and I always remember hearing him being involved in debate. And so I have that background. He would write letters, you know, for newspapers and so forth. As a matter of fact, later in life, and I'm going to get ahead of myself here for a moment, I found an article that he had written that was published in a newspaper, and in it, he made the argument about how Sunday was not the Sabbath, and he mentioned this. Now, he never mentioned anything like that to me, but he mentioned it being on the seventh day of the week and mentioning Saturday, and I find that really interesting that he wrote something like that in an article about the United States of America. But anyway, I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I'm just giving you a little bit of background about him and that kind of intellectual type of culture that included history and included religion and so forth like that. But it also, included this rough way of life, because it was from my father that my brother learned to fight and so forth like that as well. But and then of course I learned as well from my brother. But some change had happened, and I ended up having to move back to South Florida. And once again, back into that environment that I told you that I had left before. But this time, I was older and a lot more angry than I was when I had even left, because of just the years of experience. But this is where a lot of changes start to happen for me. And this is around, I end up coming back and I end up completing about a year of schooling. And after about a year of school, this massive hurricane called Hurricane Andrew ripped through. And this is back in 1992. So this should give you an example of my age. I'm getting older, right? I'm up there in age now, not too old, but this Hurricane Andrew, ripped through South Florida and Miami in 1992, and it devastated the whole area. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a background of how devastating it was, it caused before Hurricane Katrina in 2000. I think Hurricane Katrina was in 2005. I think it was. But before Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Andrew was considered, the most expensive hurricane ever to, I believe, in the United States, to hit the United States. It cost like over $26 billion of damage in Miami. It destroyed over 25,000 homes and another 100 completely destroyed, decimated over 25,000 homes and damaged over another 100,000. It was pretty significant. It led directly and indirectly to around 65 deaths, so it didn't have as many deaths as something like Hurricane Katrina, I don't believe, at all. But as far as the cost and the impact of what it did to the economy, because it was so bad, and it was particularly in the county where I lived, which was hit hard, which was Dade County. Um, it was so bad that the military had to come in because you couldn't recognize the area. So the military came in and they had martial law, and there were soldiers that were walking around, with their guns in the evenings. And if you were out in the evening, because of all the looting and the robbing and the stealing and all the problems that were happening, unfortunately, with disaster, you have some people that come out with unfortunate, ill intentions, especially in this area. So they actually had to have martial law, and if you were out in the evening time, they could have shot you. So it was pretty significant going through this. And just to kind of, you know, give you a neat fact, the wind force speeds during Hurricane Andrew, and there were of course also many tornadoes that were in that hurricane, but the wind force speed was around 166 miles per hour, or I guess that would be for you guys 268 kilometers per hour. And there was also reports of wind speeds of up to 177 miles per hour. Of course, that would be 285 kilometers per hour. Well, because of this devastating event, the area was decimated. I ended up moving to another area, to Central Florida, and it was a little small area in Central Florida. And this is interesting for me because it was a Hispanic family that my mother had worked with, and they were friends, and the schools were closed down, and everything was really bad. No one had food and water and so forth like that, and so I wasn't able to start the school year on time because of this. And this family offered my mother to let me come and stay with them until she could get relocated out of the area because it wasn't functioning. It was devastated. And this was a Christian family. And again, they were a Pentecostal family. And I'm living with this family. And at this time, I play guitar, and I have my own interests and so forth. I listened to a lot of heavy metal and so forth, and I played heavy metal. And this was kind of my upbringing. But this was a Christian family, and they went to church every single Sunday. Now, I didn't really want to go to church with them. I didn't really want to get involved with that. But out of respect to them, because of the kindness that they were showing, I would go to church with them. And they would do that stuff where you have the shaking of your hands, and you hit the person on the head and they fall down and so forth, and they shake. And it had that kind of stuff. For what it's worth, that was the type of environment. But they got me a Bible. They bought me a Bible. And I was going through a lot of changes in my mind during this time. And I remember one of the days that they went to church, I stayed behind. I didn't go with them because I only went a few times. Uh, but I stayed behind, and I started to look at the Bible that they gave me. And I remember reading through the book of Proverbs, and I read through Ecclesiastes. And those books really spoke to me. And what I've always appreciated about Proverbs and what I've appreciated about Ecclesiastes is you don't have to have some background knowledge in it. It speaks to the soul in a real plain and simple manner. And so it spoke to me with where I was at in my life in a basic manner. And I remember this day, and I call it my God moment, where I'm wrestling with all these questions, and I don't know what's going on in my life, and I'm sitting outside, and they live in a trailer, and I'm in this trailer with them, but in the front of the trailer there is they had this big beautiful tree, and you had all these leaves all over up in the tree, and it had been raining that day, and the clouds were all out, but it had stopped raining for a moment. And I walked out and I sat down, and as I'm sitting down, I'm sitting there on the ground, and I decide to say a prayer. And I say it real simple. I say, God, if you're there, please just let me know. I let me know if you're there. I really didn't know, and I felt alone. And there were other things that had happened to me I'm not going into detail about. But right when I said that, and I mean right when I said that, the clouds above kind of opened up, and sunlight came down, and this like circle of sunlight, and it was like spherical. It came down and it shone over me, and it wasn't shining over to the right, it wasn't shining over to the left. That was all still in the shade and the shadow. It was just shining over me, and it was literally right when I said that prayer, and I started feeling my skin being warmed by the sun. And I remember, like, my eyes kind of watering because I really felt something had happened there. It was like a simple answer of prayer from God, and I could sense it. And but I was only here in this living arrangement for a couple months, and it was different for me because here I am living with a Hispanic family, and they're Christians, and I'm having to go to this little small school, which was, I guess you could say, back then we have this here in the United States, we have an expression, we call it a redneck. It's a lot of the Southern boys and so forth like that listen to country and you know, really embrace the Southern heritage and so forth like that. And it was one of those little schools. And this little Hispanic family I'm living with, they were being treated bad by some of the people, at the school, that they let me know there were problems there. And so again, once again, I'm put in an environment where it's the exact opposite of what I was used to, and other people are not enjoying it. And here I am living with these people, and they're Christian, and they're being kind to me. And so that kind of bothers me. And when I'm in that environment, and it was unusual because that's, usually I would be the one in the reverse role. And here's one where it wasn't like that. And I'll never forget one day, because I'm living with this family and they don't know what I am or who I am. And they're suspecting I might be an Hispanic like them, but I'm not, but they're confused because I'm living with them. And I'll never forget, one of these guys, because I'm sitting with him, he doesn't know my background or anything like that. And he looks at me and he goes, "Boy, what breed are you?" Says it just like that. "Boy, what breed? What breed are you?" Like that, with that kind of voice. And I looked at him and I said, "What breed?" Like I was an animal, because I was with these Hispanic friends or whatever. And I didn't answer him kindly because of it, because it was disrespectful. And which was kind of strange, because if that had happened to me in Miami, it wouldn't have bothered me, and I was more likely to fight Hispanics and blacks in Miami. But here I am in an environment with Christians, and my mindset's changing, and now I have these white boys with the attitude. And I remember sitting there thinking, and the thought came to my mind as, man, you know what? All dogs have fleas. All dogs have fleas. You really have the good and you really have the bad. You don't just have some group of people and they're good, and this other group. No, no, you really have people who are a problem across the spectrum. And so again, it's things like this that you take mental note of. And I won't get into detail, but I almost got into a physical altercation with that guy over that incident and over the question that he asked. But I ended up having to move from this area after a couple months of going there. And during this time period, I'm in high school, and I ended up going to 5 different high schools. And this is where I end up, by the way, meeting Timothy Pernick. That's the gentleman that you that I co-authored the book with on vaccination. And at this time, we're in high school, we're young, and the area is in the greater Tampa Bay area and Florida. And I ended up going to this, I guess you could say, a nice school. It was a nice school. It was where my good friend, who's my good friend now, was going. And no one's jumping you. You don't have to worry about getting into fights. You don't have to worry about attitudes. You're actually, able to just kind of focus on your schoolwork like you're supposed to do. I wasn't used to that type of environment, but here I am in this environment, and it's a nice reprieve, if I could put it to you like that. And what's interesting is during this time period, uh, my older brother, he had stayed in Missouri because of a relationship that he was in with a girlfriend. He ended up having a child and so forth like that actually at a young age, and he had to do things a lot differently, the hard road, so to speak. But during this time period, my older brother, he had seen, and just so you know, my older brother, he's now deceased. He's actually not alive anymore. But and that's another story. But at this time period, he in fact, my brother used to do radio shows that people may have heard of before. His name was he went by DS Farris. Um, and he had this radio show called Hearing the Truth Radio. And he would really attack dispensationalism and so forth like that. And he would present Bible prophecy, rough around the edges, but very meticulous, a very meticulous student of Scripture. This was, many years ago. He's been deceased for a while now. But again, back to this time period where I moved and I went to, several different high schools. My brother had attended a prophecy, a Daniel and Revelation prophecy meeting seminar, and it was at a hotel. And lo and behold, it was held by Adventists. Now, he didn't know it at the time. We didn't know what Adventists were. And when they would hold these evangelistic meetings at the time, they wouldn't tell you who they were. They would just present the Bible truth. They would present the prophecy, and they would try to get you to think for yourself so that you didn't have any preconceived ideas to shut them out. But he had been listening to some of these Daniel and Revelation seminars and watching them. And the reason why he went is he had gotten a little brochure that showed beasts and it showed dragons, and it was the stuff that he had seen when he was that reminded him of when he was in the private school that he had gone to when he was a kid, when he got kicked out of public school, and they had been teaching dispensational prophecy. And so had it not been for that awareness and what they showed him, he wouldn't have even recognized those beasts with the horns on their head and so forth. So that background caught his attention and got him to actually take interest and go to those meetings. And so without missing a beat, because my brother always looked out after me and he was a big influence on my life, he sent me the little booklet, one of the booklets that they gave him called The Beast, the Dragon, and the Woman from Amazing Facts by Joe Cruz. And he also sent me one of their comic books. Again, it was on prophecy and the change of Sabbath to Sunday. And he sent me a book that called The Great Controversy by E.G. White. And that's what it said it was a little paperback, E.G. White. And, at this time, I'm in 10th grade in high school. And one of the things that we loved was studying history. So I already had a background where I enjoyed studying history. It was something that fascinated me. So I had no problem reading The Beast, the Dragon, and the Woman, which of course goes through history, with Daniel, with the kingdoms and so forth like that, the rise of the Antichrist. And so it was easy for me to see that. And then to see the change from Sunday to Sabbath, and you look at the 4th century and Constantine. And again, at this time, I'm reading this stuff. You have to envision this, that I have really long hair. My hair is like down to really long, almost down to my waist. I have real long hair. I play guitar. I play heavy metal music. And I'm into martial arts and I'm into fighting because my brother was very much into martial arts. And so I'm studying this, and this is still nothing's changing about me per se, but I'm learning these facts, and they're actually intellectually compelling. They're intellectually compelling. And I actually start sharing it with other people. And some of my friends now who actually are Adventists, it goes back to this. I started believing these things about prophecy without knowing who a Seventh-day Adventist was. I still don't know that the material that I had given to me was from Seventh-day Adventists, but I'm sharing it and I'm believing in it. I'm just talking to people, when I'm at school or I'm out walking about. I find it interesting. As a matter of fact, this is how I end up becoming friends with Timothy Pernick, again, who I know that some of you are familiar with. Uh, I'm in 10th grade and I'm in this class, and this teacher starts making some statements. And she makes a statement facetiously about the mark of the beast. And it was made in a comical type of manner. Again, this is public school. And I speak up and I start talking about, the triple mitre crown, and I talk about vicarious filii Dei, and I talk about the Latin numerals and the calculation, and while I'm doing this, and I'm doing this in the class, I could care less, about who could hear me or anything like that. There wasn't some kind of Christianity that I had attached myself to per se at this point, but I am persuaded by these truths, and by this history. And while I'm saying that, Tim is in the background, Tim Pernick, and he smarts off to me. He actually smarts off because he, like me, he came from a Catholic background as well, and he makes a kind of a snarky reply because of what I'm saying. And now, again, I'm not converted. I'm not a Christian. I'm thinking, who's this wise guy? Who's this wise guy running his mouth back there? Because I'm not. In my mindset, I'm not thinking about turn the other cheek yet. I'm thinking maybe your cheek should get turned with one of these. It's that kind of mindset. And but somehow or another, him and I end up becoming friends. And actually, we were working out at the gym, is what it is. And neither of us have weightlifting partners. And so as we're working out, and this happens, I would say, the summer after my 10th grade year. And I'm starting to change. And now I'm starting to become more persuaded by Christianity, not just the prophecy, but the belief in Jesus Christ, because I start becoming persuaded that if these things are true, then you have that prophecy in Daniel that points, to the death of the Messiah and the cross and so forth, that no, there's more to this. And I start believing the words of Scripture. Like, if this prophecy is true, then everything else in the Bible has to be true too, including the testimony about Jesus Christ and the cross. And not only that, but also the testimony about creation in Genesis. The teaching of evolution can't possibly be the case if the Bible's true. And particularly when you look at things from a prophetic perspective, and you see the eschatological significance of the Sabbath day, and then you see its origins at the creation of the world and the great war that the enemy has on God's commandments. But I end up becoming friends at this time period with Tim, because we're working out together, and my thoughts are changing. Again, I don't know who a Seventh-day Adventist is, had never heard of them. And my 11th grade year, I end up writing this paper in my English class on the conversion of Sunday to the Sabbath. And I don't even really know, I actually do not know that the book, The Great Controversy, was written by a woman named Ellen White. I just knew it was E.G. White. And in the paper that I'm writing, I write something along the lines, when I'm quoting from The Great Controversy, Mr. White, because I still don't, I'm not being careful, I guess you could say, with my research at that point. I should have been able to see that it was, a woman, but I just went off the front cover, E.G. White. But I wrote this paper, and I would go to the library at this time, and I would check out church history books. Particularly, some of the ones that I checked out were written by Catholic historians. And I read and I learned on my own about the change, of from Sunday to the Sabbath, with Constantine going back to the 4th century. And I saw some of the laws, and I saw how they were still keeping the Sabbath, but at the same time they started celebrating on Sunday. And I saw how it was in memory of, the venerable day of the sun. And I started seeing that history, and it was so much more persuasive to me when I looked at it from a historical point of view, that I started changing. And that's where I would start these conversations with Tim. And I would start sharing some of these arguments with him and share some of this literature. And I know you have his testimony where he tells you about some of this and how he started reading it. But this was the origin, this was the background of it. These conversations that we had, from me studying these things from the information that had been given to me from my brother. I at this time was looking around for a group called Amazing Facts, because I didn't know where this information was coming from. And, so again, it was a fascinating time period. And the reason why it was a fascinating time period is because I'm living in an area where I have quietude. and I'm able to have reflection over the things that I'm studying without aggravation and agitation and needing to defend myself and needing to fight. I'm in a quiet area by myself thinking, and of course I'm just living with my mother, and it's it's it's, it's almost like God was intervening in my life even though I was moving from place to place, but setting me in an area where I could have quietude and where I could read undisturbed and where I could think and be persuaded, if you will, by the stuff that I was studying. And um, shortly after this, and I ended up finding out, and this is where it gets really interesting. I ended up finding out that it was the material came from Seventh Day Adventists, and it's also important for me to point out that I started keeping the Sabbath before knowing who the Seventh Day Adventists were, but I didn't, and I was doing it on my own. I wasn't going to any churches, and I got some of my friends to keep the Sabbath with me. Actually, one of my friends, he went on, who I'm telling you about, he actually went on and studied biblical archaeology and is in a college professor and so forth like that now. But at this time, me and this gentleman, he a week started keeping Sabbath from 12 o'clock to 12 o'clock on Saturday. We didn't know about sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. So here we are, we're in high school, and we start doing Saturday from 12 to 12 because I don't know yet. I don't know all the details. I'm just kind of becoming convinced because of Bible prophecy. And around this time period, my older brother finally finds out it's the Seventh Day Adventists. And he tells me it's this group of people called the Seventh Day Adventists. And I'm like, the Seventh Day Adventists? Okay. And so I look in the phone book. This is before there was internet and so forth like that, to try to find a Seventh Day Adventist church to see who these people are. And this is where it gets real interesting. Now, when you think about my whole background that I told you about with the racial tensions and my upbringing, is I find this church, and it's a small little church, and it's Jamaican. It's entirely black. And I get in my vehicle and I drive and I go to this place, and there's this Jamaican, and he speaks with the accent, the heavy, Islander sounding voice. And he's looking at me, and I have this real long hair, and I'm like, are you guys the Seventh Day Adventist? And do you believe that the papacy represents the man of sin, or in the system of the Antichrist? And I'm real straightforward. And he kind of looks at me. He's an older man. He kind of chuckles. He goes, well, yes. Um, he's real serious. He goes, come on in and see what we believe, young man. But of course, with an accent real strong. And I go in, and again, every single person in there's black, Jamaican. And I'm like, wow, this is interesting. But they're treating me nice. And as a matter of fact, within 5 minutes of being there, I completely don't even realize that I'm the only white guy there. And I feel welcomed. And so Jesus is really working with me. And it's funny how that this ends up being the scenario that I end up coming into. And when I leave the church service, around this time period, I'm also getting ready to move from the area, to move back down to South Florida. And I end up doing this my senior year of high school. I moved my last year of high school back to South Florida. But what's interesting is that, these are the Seventh Day Adventists. And I leave and I say to myself, I go, and I have no idea how big the Seventh Day Adventist church is. I don't know about the worldwide body of believers. And I say to myself, okay, if it's this group of Jamaicans, if it's this group of Jamaicans who are believing this, I'm right there with them, because this stuff is true. Now I can't believe that it's like, wow, it's just this little small group of people who believe in this message. This is an amazing message. Why don't more people know about this? And if it's going to be me hanging out with the Jamaicans and preaching this message, so be it. I could care less. I was so persuaded. I was so convinced by it. And so it was an interesting experience, to say the least. And shortly after this, before I moved back down to South Florida, my brother gets me to come up to Missouri and to get baptized at the church where he ended up. And so I, becoming baptized and he became convinced and so forth like that, the one that the prophecy seminar led him to. And I showed up, and now it was a different area. It was in Missouri, and it was a big church. It wasn't, it wasn't the same. And I was like, okay, this is different. Wow, okay, I didn't realize that so they're bigger than I realized, this Adventist group of people. And when I go in before I get baptized, they hand me these beliefs telling me what I'm supposed to believe, these fundamental beliefs that I'm not familiar with. And I look at them, I believe in the Sabbath, I believe in all these things, the state of man and death and so forth. But then it gets down to the statement about the gift of prophecy through Ellen White. And again, this is my baptism day, and I go, who's this Ellen White? I don't even know who Ellen White is, because I already believe in all these things. But then there's the statement about needing to believe in Ellen White. And I asked my older brother, I said, what's this? Who's this Ellen White person that they're telling me, that I need to believe in order to get baptized? And my brother looks at me and he goes, you know that book that I gave you called The Great Controversy? He goes, she's the one who wrote that book. Is there anything in there that you disagree with? I go, oh, no, not at all. He goes, yeah, that's kind of what I felt. I didn't really care about it because everything that we believed was coming from Holy Scripture. And so I was like, okay. And so I ended up getting baptized. And then shortly after that, I didn't stay there. I just literally flew up there to get baptized at that church. And then I flew back down to Florida, and then I ended up moving down to South Florida. And this is where changes, I guess you could say. Really, I start to learn more deeply about theology and Adventism and so forth like that, because where I end up moving, the house that I end up moving to is right next to the pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist church that I end up attending. And it's interesting because this church that I attended, the reason why I found it was because I was driving down the road and there was this sign, and the sign said, Sunday is not the Sabbath, Saturday is. And then it said, Sunday is the mark of the beast. Now you could say, hey, that's not the most tactic form of evangelism, but that's actually what this sign said along the side of the road. And shortly after it, there was the Seventh-day Adventist church. And again, this is before the internet and all that type of stuff. This is the way that it was. And I pull into this church, and there's a young friend that I have with me. He eventually becomes an SDA as well, a good close friend of mine. And he's with me, and I pull into this church, and I walk in, and I end up seeing the pastor, and I'm still good friends with this pastor to this day. His name was Kevin Powell, and Pastor Kevin Powell. And I walk in, and I look at him. It's a young man. I'm a teenager at this time. I'm in high school, 17 years old, and my senior year of high school. And I look at him, and I say, hey, is this the church, the Seventh-day Adventist church that you guys believe? Because I haven't attended any church at this point where I'm a member or I'm going to it. I'd only been to that one Jamaican church that one time, and then the church that I went to with my brother where I got baptized that one time, and then I left. So I have never experienced a church family or a place that I would call home, but this would become that place. And as I go in there, I say, hey, do you guys believe that the Pope's the Antichrist? I say that right to the pastor. And he kind of looks at me and he smiles real big, and he's like, yeah. Because I said, yeah, because I saw that sign down the road, and, it made the statement about Sunday being the mark of the beast. And he goes, well, yes, that's actually not our sign. That was another, church that had put that up, because I could tell he was trying to distance himself from it because he wouldn't have done it that way. But to me, that spoke to me. That was the language that I understood. Bible prophecy, the end of the world, being able to understand who the Antichrist of Scripture is, and that we're living in the last days of Earth's history, and we need to get prepared for what's coming upon this world. And so that was the mindset, that I approached it. Well, while going to this church, I got to know these people, and all the people that I ended up becoming friends with, they were like in their 50s and 60s. They were older people. They tried to direct me to like a class where there were younger people. And I noticed with the younger people, they weren't into the Bible. They had their own this is where I found out about quarterlies. And they would have these quarterlies that would just sit around and tell stories. They didn't get into meat. And to me, I had already grown up in the world. I didn't need I didn't want to hear little stories and kiddie stuff. I wanted really serious stuff. I wanted the meat. And for some reason, everyone thought that was kind of strange that this 17-year-old young person's coming in and he doesn't want to. I just wanted to, to study Bible theology, and I would do it all day long. I did it very seriously. When I would get out of school, it was scripture. I would start studying the scripture, and that's kind of the way that it was. And so I wouldn't go to those young people places. I would be studying with the adult, as they call it, the adult Sabbath schools. And I ended up becoming friends with these old timers, and would go out and do stuff. And as a matter of fact, during this time, because of my upbringing, I started doing prison ministry. Like when I had turned 18, I started going into prisons. And I remember this one time when I went into this prison. When you in this area, when you go into prison, they go up to the bars, and they yell church, church, and I remember, you know, when I went, and this was in Fort Lauderdale. I went, and there was, a lot of the guys that were in there. They were all black boys, black guys, and they started cussing at me. And I'm standing on calling me cracker again. So this is different because it was get out of here, cracker, that kind of stuff. And there's so much more I could say to you about that type of stuff with my upbringing, but we don't have time for that. But here I am. I'm now a Christian. My frame of mind has changed, and now I'm in this prison, and all these guys, and the cop tells me, he says, what they would do is they would open up the bars, and then you'd go in, and then you would, have Bible study with them, and whoever wanted to come and have Bible study with you would. And so here I am, and before I even get in, some of the people on the other side of the bars are threatening me, calling me white boy, calling me cracker, and doing all that kind of stuff. And if anyone raised their hand and said, hey, I want to have Bible study, and there were like 3 or 4 guys that said, hey, I'd like to have Bible study. And I ended up going in, and this was one of the first times that I did this. I ended up going in. They shut the bars behind me. I'm like, I'm going with the Lord, and his angels are going to come with me. I'm not worried. I'm not going to fret over these people threatening me. And right when I get in, 3 or 4 people come, and then all of a sudden, the other people who were too scared to raise their hands, they start coming and they start surrounding me. And then those guys who were threatening me, they weren't stopping while I'm in there, and they're starting to walk around and they're starting to act hard and tough. And what was funny is one of the guys who came to have the Bible study, he was a big guy, and he turned to the guys who were acting hard and threatening me. And I'm not going to be able to say it. He said it in unpleasant words, telling them to be quiet, if you know what I mean, but with vulgarity and firmness of threatening them, saying, hey, can you shut up, that type of thing. We're trying to have Bible study, and if you don't, we're going to have a problem right now. So for me, I grew up like that with that type of language and that background. So it didn't faze me at the time, but it's funny when I look at it and I think about it, you just don't know where people are at and how God can reach people where they're at. And so here I am in an environment where just a couple of years before I would have been fighting these people, but instead here I am praying with them, having devotion. I mean, sharing Bible prophecy, and it was a total different mindset. Well, at this time frame, when I'm going to this church, this is where I started learning about health reform from this pastor. And they started this little clinic at the church, and it was called God's Way Clinic. And people would come in and they would learn about vegetarian cooking. They would learn about juicing. They would learn about, you know, the problems with drugs, which, by the way, this is in some ways is kind of unusual in Adventism, because much of Adventism has, as a part of mainstream medicine with MD directed medicine and, promoting, things that are more within that framework of healthcare, where this was a church where it was questioning that framework of healthcare. Not that it was saying, hey, no surgery, no medication or anything like that, but it was telling you the problems with some of these things while simultaneously promoting information on botanical medicine, promoting information on hydrotherapy. And I noticed that a lot of people in the community, because of this little God's Way clinic that they started, would come in and visit. They would learn about healthy vegetarian cooking. They would learn about juicing. They would learn about hydrotherapy, and there would be people there who did massage and so forth like that. And I started to become persuaded by it, and I started learning about these things, and it led me to start questioning things. So the beginnings, the inklings of me beginning to question um, medicine, and start thinking about things when it relates to your human body and it being the temple of the Holy Spirit was in this environment. And it came from a conviction of biblical truth, if you will. Biblical truth persuaded me to study more about health. And I know I'm kind of all over the place here a little bit, but I should go ahead and say this to you that I ended up going to school, and I ended up getting a degree initially because I loved history. I got a bachelor's degree in history because it was studying history that led me to understand Bible prophecy. So I ended up getting this bachelor's degree in history. But I also ended up going to Texas and going to Southwestern Adventist University, and I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in theology. I got a BA degree in theology. And, I remember while I was studying theology, my mindset was very much persuaded about, the truth about health reform and so forth like that. And I was asking questions. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I also eventually get a master's degree in history, just so you know, and I'm planning on getting a PhD in history. And I'm having to study all these languages to get a PhD in history. And it is around this time period that my brother dies. And I won't get into all of his details, but I will say that my brother had struggles that were in his life, and he ended up going to medical professional. He struggled with drinking and so forth like that, and he had a hard time kicking it. And he ended up sadly getting help, and they put him on some medication, and the medication that he was taking ended up taking his life. It was, and I mean, I already knew at this time there were problems with medicine, problems with drugs. I'd already been studying about it. I'd studied a lot, and this is something that you may talk with me about another time, but especially with both Timothy Pernick and I started seeing all the problems with psychiatry and children who were being drugged incessantly with psychiatric medication and so forth like that. And that really opened up a different world to me as well. But I will say this, and I'm going to back up a little bit. Um, I ended up getting married, and my firstborn child, before my child was born, my older brother said to me, he said, "Hey, Michael, do not vaccinate. Do not vaccinate your child and your baby." And I said, why? I didn't really know why. He goes, "Just trust me, Michael." Uh, he explained some stuff that he had been studying, and uh, I don't want to get into too much detail, but someone had gotten injured by vaccines and the family, and he was very cr- alarmed by it. And so he started looking into it, and as he studied into it, he started finding out about vaccine injury, the vaccine injury compensation program, and he warned me. And he said, "Just look into it." And I said, "Okay." And I always took the reason why I became a Christian was because of my older brother. The reason why I studied history was because of my older brother. The reason why I studied martial arts was because of my older brother. The reason why I did most of the stuff that I did was because of my brother Dax. And so when my brother got on the phone with me before my firstborn came into this world, he said, "Hey, do not vaccinate your daughter." And I said, "Okay." That was all I needed to hear. I'm taking my brother's word for this. And after my daughter was born, sure enough, I ended up having an incident. I had an incident at the hospital. I didn't want them putting stuff in my daughter's eyes at the time. They were going to put some antibiotics in her eyes and so forth like that. I'm in the hospital. This is where I start to realize how powerful the medical profession is. I say, "Excuse me, please don't put that on her eyes." And the nurse actually puts her arm over my child and says, "No, step back." And tells me this. Here I am, my newborn, and the nurse puts the arm over my daughter and tells me to step back. And I say, "What are you doing?" I said, you do not put that on my child's eyes. And the nurse says, I'm going to have to take action if you do not step back. This child is not going to leave this hospital unless you let me do this. And she's threatened me. And I'm in a strange state of mind because what do you, this is my child and you're telling me how it's going to be. And this is one of the things where I started realizing how much better off people are generally, to have home births and to go through midwives and so forth like that, because the medical profession is so powerful that they can actually intervene and tell you what you can and can't do with their children and even take them away from you. And I sensed it right here. And it bothered me deeply. And I was in their power. And this is unusual because normally, I had become a believer at this time, but this almost makes you rile up where you're ready to, from my upbringing, to get physical. Like, whoa, 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 that's my child. I mean, if there's anything that I'm going to die for, this is going to be it right here. But I had to think, and I had to think as a Christian and be wise. And so I let them do this, very unhappy about it. And they did it. When I got my daughter, I said, I'm not ever going back into one of these hospitals again. I don't want to go into these places. And I started studying. Again, this was a long time ago. And as I was reading and as I was studying, I started finding out more evidence about vaccination and more problems about it. And I became concerned. And I had to, at the time I was following protocol and I had to find a pediatrician. And when I went into a pediatrician with my child, the doctor, the whole reason why I came in was I just thought, hey, you needed to do this. The doctor's going to look at the child, make sure everything's healthy. But actually, the whole reason that we went in was so that they could vaccinate my child. And then I started realizing that every single appointment that they had scheduled was so that they could just vaccinate my child. And that's what they were essentially there for, was to vaccinate my child. I'm not saying that's what all pediatrics is, but generally that's what it was, for the first few months of my child's life. And I started to realize that now I didn't let him vaccinate my daughter. And as I went in, the pediatrician wanted to vaccinate my child. And I said, no, I'm not going to have you do that. I didn't come in for that. And the doctor got upset with me when I said that. I wasn't disrespectful. I was calm. At this point, I had already done enough research that I was persuaded that my brother was 100% right in warning about it. And I knew about the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Act at the time. Again, I'm a young man at this time and just in my 20s and early 20s. And when I tell him I'm not going to vaccinate my child, the doctor gets mad. And I said, hey, people get injured by vaccines. He says, that's not true. That's a lie. And he says it real firm. He goes, that's a lie. You do not know what you're saying. Vaccines do not injure. I said, what do you mean vaccines do not injure? And I gave a couple cases of how vaccine injured. I talked about the Salk polio, the oral polio, and I started going into a little bit of history of how, even with that vaccine itself, and he denied that. And he became infuriated at me for what I had to say about vaccines and not wanting to vaccinate my child, that he kicked me out of his office and told me not to come back. And, I was fine. I didn't come back. And I ended up finding another pediatrician, thank God, who said, when I went and I met him, I says, listen, I had this rough experience. And I told him what had happened. I says, look, I'm not coming in for the vaccine. I'm just coming in because to have my daughter, make sure everything's okay. And he was very respectful. He goes, no. And he actually said to me, he told you that no one's ever been injured by vaccines? I said, yeah. He goes, I'm so sorry. That's not true at all that he told you that. He says, yeah, people have been injured by vaccines. And he was aware of the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Act. He was definitely a promoter of vaccines. And every time I came in, he wanted me to sign off on me not vaccinating my daughter. And he gave me videos that I needed to watch and how vaccines are good. And of course, it always left out all sorts of details about injury and the stuff that I was studying at the time. Nevertheless, he was respectful, but that was a real learning curve for me about the medical system, again, as a young man, and how powerful they are and the type of say that they have over your children. And if I can kind of start trying to bring this to a closure, because I know I could sit here and speak for hours about all this, but I would say this is that as I began thinking, and with this frame of mindset and studying about it and questioning vaccines. I began sharing stuff with my friend Tim about vaccines. He saw what I went through with this, and he was doing legal research at the time. And he was working at a law firm and doing specific types of research for him, that he started doing research on vaccine injury. And he was pulling all sorts of data and files. And we took this information and we went to share it with the church. He actually printed out a document with some papers on vaccine injury and all sorts of stuff in certain cases. And he wanted to share it at the church that we were attending, and they were not happy about it. They did not want him sharing this information, this Adventist church. Nevertheless, they let him take the stack of papers that he printed and put them at a place in the church that was kind of inconspicuous. But it wasn't without letting us know that they were not on board and were not happy about it. So we started realizing, hey, wait a second, there are people who really, I thought you guys were into health and natural medicine, and what we ended up finding out is a lot of the Adventists that we were around, they were nurses and they were doctors and they took drugs and they were promoting vaccines and they were okay with compulsory vaccination and so forth like that. And it baffled us. It baffled us because if you study the history and you started studying the history of medicine, how could you arrive at these conclusions? Why wouldn't you be a little bit more critical? And so that did not resonate with us. So we, continued to study, we continued to do research, we continued to ask hard questions. And, there are other things that I can mention that would bring in the sciences of the mind and other things like that when it came to forced psychiatric medication as well, that we started studying and we started looking into. But I was doing it from more of a historical, we were actually both doing it from more of a historical, legal type of perspective, with theology thrown in. And we weren't sitting around studying the sciences per se and the medicine and all that. That came later. Okay. We were kind of studying that indirectly because it's a part of the conversation when you're talking about pharmaceuticals and when you're talking about vaccination or when you're talking about any type of prophylaxis that is that comes from the pharmaceutical industry. So by default, we had to study about it, and we started doing it. Well, here I am with this background, and I'm questioning these things, and I end up going and studying theology, and I take that mindset with me of questioning that system. And again, I notice that it's unwelcome there as well. And I wouldn't say that I was necessarily cantankerous or bolsterous or really zealous, but I definitely had views that were strong. And the reason why I had views that were strong about the pharmaceutical industry is because I had been in an environment, even where I worked at a school, where I would be in a court system and kids were being put on medication and so forth like that to be a part of a system. And I saw it. I saw what was happening. I had to study literature on it at the time, and I started seeing the problems with some of these systems. I started seeing them, and I started noticing as I would read through the counsels of the spirit of prophecy and so forth like that. I started seeing all these disparaging remarks about drugs, and I started seeing how they were advocating nutrition and lifestyle medicine, and I know that's a phrase that we used to say, lifestyle medicine, but more of a lifestyle approach to health with sunshine and water and rest and the simple herbs of the field. Not that anyone was against the skill of a surgeon like Harvey Kellogg or anything like that, but the approach was certainly one that was more based in natural medicine. And yet there seemed to be this glaring contradiction. There was a contradistinction between the message that I was reading and what I was seeing promoted coming from our church. And I'm not saying everything's all bad, but nonetheless, the contradistinction between the two systems is hard to miss. It's actually hard to miss. And, I can tell you this going back to, and I'll start to wrap this up, but going back to when my brother passed away and I was working on preparing to enter into a PhD program, I started having changes of thought. And that happened to him really galvanized me. And it made me go, you know what, here I am studying all this history, studying all this theology, and yet I see this great need for health reform, and I need to become more informed about it instead of just talking about it on the side. I want to embrace it. And I started looking at naturopathic medicine, and I started finding about drugless healing paradigms and modalities that existed. And I'll keep this simple, but I ended up leaving the PhD path of starting on it, and I went back and did pre-med. I did all the basic sciences, and was going to enter into. I wanted to enter into a naturopathic program, but I didn't. I ended up entering into a chiropractic school, but I didn't stay in the chiropractic school. I had these convictions. Like one of my first trimesters while I was there, I did this presentation before over 100 people on naturopathic oncology. And one of the professors came up to me and he said, I think you're in the wrong profession. I think you're in the wrong profession. And and he was right. And so nothing wrong with chiropractic. As you know, one of my good friends that I wrote the book with, he's a chiropractor, was perfectly fine. But I ended up switching fields and I left and I ended up going on and I got a master's of science in human nutrition and functional medicine. And then right after I had that background where I did that studying, I applied to 2 different doctorate programs, and I got accepted into this doctorate program, a naturopathic school out in Oregon. And I also simultaneously got accepted into this Doctor of Clinical Nutrition program out in Maryland. And so I had to pray about which direction to go. And since I had already studied the human nutrition so thoroughly, which of course includes botanicals and so forth like that, and functional medicine and so forth, I decided to go ahead and get my doctorate in clinical nutrition. And I did. And, I ended up doing my residency out there for a year for a functional medicine practice and, focusing on health reform and human nutrition. And, but the thing that galvanized me and led me to do that was my strong beliefs as a Christian. If it wasn't for that underpinning and the things that I had been reading and the things that I had seen, and there's a lot of stuff I'm not mentioning to you as well, of things that I saw that led me along the way of this journey of health reform and believing in it strongly and writing about it as the way that we did. Without Jesus Christ, without studying the Word of God, without being aware of the third angel, health reform being the right hand of the third angel's message, thinking about it as one of the finishing works that's going to go on as we near the close of probation, as time goes on to the end. One of the things that opens up doors and opens up hearts is health reform, being knowledgeable about physiology and being able to actually help people in manners that sometimes, biblical truth alone, it won't kick the door down or they won't necessarily invite you in per se. But when it comes to taking care of their well-being, and you think about Jesus Christ, and he didn't just simply teach the truth, he lived it. And one of the things we see our Lord doing is helping people and healing people and ministering to their needs. So in my view, I see Christianity in that mission field as being tremendous complements of one another. I know not everyone's called to go into that area, and people have different emphasis and different gifts and different blessings and different things that they want to focus on or study about. But I do think that Christianity and health reform is a wide open field where we can take these messages of truth and salvation, and there are hearts that are ripe and receptive, to receive the doctrines that we hold dear through knocking down those doors, or I should say, having those doors opened up through being able to bless people through these simple modalities. Because there is this, almost, if you will, this pretense that's linked to science and medicine, and people are scared of the white coat, and they feel that there's this esoteric jargon and language that you want to give your minds over to them. But yet, when you take these simple modalities from plants and from food and from water and from sunlight, and you start seeing people's health becoming transformed and changed, and then they can understand what's going on, there's an element to it that makes me think about that passage in Corinthians where it says that God confounds the wise, right, with the simple. And so these simple modalities, we have a mighty God, a wonderful God, and he gave us these things so that we could become intelligent, actually, about things, although they're complex, they're simple enough for us to understand and actually have and our own reach for healing, for health. So, in a nutshell, you have this testimony for me, from my beginning to my end, and again, um, there you go. My name is Michael Farris, and this is my little short testimony that I shared with you. So, blessings.